Hello. I always feel like I need to start these things off with a joke. Um, so why did the chicken cross the road? Just kidding. I'm Elizabeth. If you don't already know me, that's odd because we've been in classes together for quite some time. So I wanted to, before I start, I wanted to show you my assistant in my presentation. This is Mitzi. She is a therapy bunny in training, per my um, decision. I don't know that that's actually a real thing. Anyway, isn't she cute? Okay, so my research proposal, and this is going to switch back and forth between my face and the actual research, so it can be, oh, maybe I can pull up at the same time. I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can do this. Maybe it'll work. Can we see that a little bit? Oh, it's really small, but that's okay. It's just off to the side. Okay, so the title of my research proposal is Comparative Post-Traumatic Growth in Survivors of Commercial Childhood Sexual Exploitation. That's a big mouthful. I first want to give my background on it because I feel like that's important, especially when understanding like how limitations impact the research we do. So a lot of you know, but I worked in a residential facility that was kind of a mix of psychiatric and behavioral, but it was specifically for youth who identified as girls who were commercial childhood sexual exploitation survivors. That whole big word or whole big phrase, commercial childhood sexual exploitation, we can actually just shorten to CSEC. So as anytime that I say CSEC or CSE youth within this presentation, I want you to remember back and think, oh, commercial childhood sexual exploitation. So I worked in a CSEC specific residential facility for 2.5 years. And CSEC also, I meant to say this, many people know it as human trafficking. So this is just specifically sexual human trafficking with youth. So I worked in a CSEC specific facility for 2 years. That is such a mouthful. 2.5 years, actually. I did some floor work there and I did some case management. And when I was a case manager, I really had the opportunity to get to know the systems that the clients were involved in, number one. And I kind of started to see this theme where youth don't, like when they leave facilities, they tend to have a bit of a dip actually in their functionality, which is pretty interesting. And so after talking to, like I said, I got really involved with kind of the networks in the area that are other, like DHS, law enforcement, some other nonprofits. They're also fighting the anti-trafficking network. And fun fact, there is a quarterly meeting called the Multnomah County Sex Trafficking Meeting, which is so poorly named. It's not for sex traffickers, it's for people fighting sex trafficking. And so we would always joke when we would go that we're going to the sex trafficking meeting, and it was a whole other thing. Anyway, so that kind of, it's interesting, this dip when survivors graduate programs, and then they tend to do well a little bit later. And so it kind of just got me thinking, like, what are residential facilities effective? Are they effective in treating this stuff? Or is there something else? Because residential facilities are really expensive. They have a really high toll on insurance companies. It's really hard to get people, whatchamacallit, I can't remember the word. Basically, it's really hard to get insurance to pay for residential facilities, and so the longer they have to stay there, the it just takes a massive toll. I think the facility I worked in was like $650 a day, and that might be less actually than I'm remembering, per client, because there's so many staff, and there's really high needs, and so I think there's a lot of people that are going, is this really necessary and is it really helpful? And even within the greater anti-human trafficking initiatives, there's also this question of, do we want to lock up people? And by people, I mean youth, because you can't lock up adults, which has this whole other thing. I mean, you can if they've committed a crime, but do we want to lock up youth who have been exploited? Or is that furthering their experience of confinement and exploitation in some way? And so it would be really interesting. There's not a lot of research that has been done around this. So human trafficking in general, there's not been a lot of research done, specifically around treatment methods and the effectiveness of residential facilities. There hasn't been a lot done. So let's get to literature review. Something that I feel like is important to know is just how much human trafficking and CSEC has been sensationalized. You know, one of my favorite shows is Law and Order SVU. If you know me, you know that I've been binging it recently because I got COVID at the beginning of November and just started watching it again. And Olivia Benson's always in the background, and she's always coming into the survivors going, it's not your fault. But even in that, which tries to be relevant with the issues that are happening in the day-to-day, you see this, like, these girls are trapped in this brothel from another country, and the first time, actually, I saw maybe 2 or 3 seasons ago, the first time I saw it portrayed differently and more accurately was a brother pimped out his sister, and she was consensual. But something that's important to know is that there's no such thing as consent when you are paying for sex with someone who is underage or trading something for sex with someone who's underage. So that's just a little example. It's been really sensationalized. People don't really understand what it looks like. And there has been a decent amount of research done on risk factors. We have, from the literature, we see that higher ACE scores, that's adverse childhood experiences, higher scores there indicate a higher risk for exploitation, because part of that is the kids have, like, their attachments kind of jacked up, honestly, and they're looking for safety in people who aren't necessarily safe. And so something that will happen is they'll get a boyfriend who they're sleeping with, who's older or even same age, who all of a sudden says, hey, I need you to sleep with this person so that we can, like, if you love me, you'll do this. And it's this cycle of it's the control, power, abuse cycle, right? It just plays out differently. And so specifically children who have seen a lot of domestic violence in the home, children who have been sexually abused themselves, or kids who are just trying to get their needs met, whether it be emotionally, physically, mentally, whatever it may be. Those kids are at really high risk. And something you actually see is there's these different levels of conceptualization of why this happens, right? So most of the theories have been, or most of the conceptualizations have been made for adults. So the one that's most relevant to kids is actually called ecological systems theory. And so it's basically pulling in, I have one line in here that's just phenomenal. I can't remember where it is though, so give me one moment. Basically, it's a cycle, right? So you're seeing this socioeconomic, uh, like the socioeconomic status can very directly correlate to those higher ACE scores. And so if you are lower socioeconomically, you're more likely to be involved in sex work even. And so ecological systems theory is pulling in both the environment that the child is in and the family system, which is, then working with attachment and roles and like that kind of thing, so those are kind of pulling together the things they've talked about so far. Yeah, so like I said, the CSEC specific treatment methods have not been researched very much at all. There have been some small program specific evaluations, but even those are generally focused on programs in other countries. And I didn't mention this earlier because it's not super pertinent to my research, because I'm specifically focusing on people in or survivors in the United States, but it's very different internationally. Like how there are similar risk factors for sure, but just because of the way that our systems are built and the way that families interact, how it plays out looks really different. And there hasn't even been a lot of research around that, which is another area that needs to be researched more. But in general, there haven't been really many CSEC specific treatment methods. And things that are important to consider when developing those or looking at those things are having them be multiculturally sensitive, trauma informed, having a high level of clinician skill, which we'll get to in a second, and also being very aware of the conceptualization of the youth within, again, that system. Because if you're looking at even like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you have a kid who doesn't have food or doesn't have reliable shelter, they're not going to be super concerned about their mental wellness. They just want to eat and they just want a place to sleep under. And so they're going to trade sex in that way, and similarly, if they don't have emotional connectedness and attachment and well-being, they're going to do what they're going to do to get close enough to that or closer to that, right? And if you're looking at some of the comorbidities, along those treatment methods, I kind of paired that with exit methods. And exit methods, it just relates to how women leave the sex trade, how girls, how youth, how anybody leaves the sex trade. So some of those really common things are spiritual changes, like finding a higher power or having a child, or intensive mental health issues. So that last one is kind of what I'm focusing on for the last little bit of the literature review, and looking at those comorbidities with the exploitation of youth. So you see a lot of PTSD, obviously, but it's also really hard because these people, they come from places that also have often like parents with significant mental health symptoms. So it's really hard to differentiate between the organic and the traumagenic pathology. And traumagenic just means what comes from trauma. And organic obviously means just brain matter. And those get really mixed up and twisted, and it can take a long time to do that brain rewiring, which again is part of why we're trying to see, do residential facilities really work? Because especially longer term ones, which I don't focus on in here, but if we're talking about taking some time to rewire your brain, then you need a little bit of time. So yeah, you also have things like somatic symptoms, depression, anxiety, suicide attempts, hyper or hypoarousal, dissociation, distractibility, flashbacks, nightmares, self-injury, and substance abuse. Substance abuse is a big one, and definitely a necessary part of a lot of treatment programs, because there's a whole other thing. I'm not going to get super in depth. I know we're running short on time. And then just looking at cultural and clinician competency, and there's not a lot of training specific for clinicians to work with CSEC specific clients. There's just not. And so looking at what does it look like to gain competency in that, and then finally, which is the piece that I'm really looking at here, is what does post-traumatic growth look like in CSEC survivors? So they apparently, one study found that higher levels of post-traumatic growth appear to be a mitigating factor in the expression of symptoms associated with PTSD. The amount of post-traumatic growth a CSEC survivor reports is connected to the amount of social support received, counseling, and inherent resiliency traits. Fascinating. But there has not been a study that looks at whether or not residential programs work, but we're using them all the time. So for my my methodology and my research question, all that, we're getting into that section. Research question. I just talked about how there have not been a lot of studies written, period, but specifically for residential facilities, not much has been done. So this study will examine the impact of CSEC-specific residential facilities in the U.S. on post-traumatic growth and sustained abstinence from commercial sexual exploitation for participants. What that means is I'm looking at the correlation between post-traumatic growth and those who have been in residential facilities, or those who have not. So, and it's U.S. specific, and I define abstinence as, well, we'll get to that in a second. So I said participants could be 16 years or older. They need to be out of the sex trade for at least 3 or more years at the time of participation. And they can be self-identified. I think it would be, honestly, the study would be pretty hard, I think, to find participants for, because the nature of the sex trade is so illicit, right? And so my best guess right now, but I would love some more ideas. My best guess right now, though, is to have participants or go to like community mental health places and say, hey, if you have any clients who fit this bill, would you tell them about the study, send them our way? That being said, that also skews the results, because then you're looking at people who are actively in a mental health counseling relationship, right? So that does skew some results. Also looking at, they must be at least 16 years of age. They must have had at least 3 months prior to age 18 of engaging in the sex industry, and so that means that they could have stopped after age 18, but from 17 years and 9 months on, or 9 months, they would have had to have had, yeah, you know what I'm trying to say. I give some guidelines for how those can be defined. I say that people can be any gender, male, female, gender non-binary, any ethnicity or socioeconomic status. But because I do think that socioeconomic status, as we've seen before in the research, does have an impact on at least a risk factor, and it might have an impact as well. I assume it would on sustained abstinence. The I would like for people to report their socioeconomic status. They can report their race if they so choose, but or ethnicity, but they don't have to. Then I give some guidelines for CSEC, or for people who were involved in a residential facility and people who were not involved in a residential facility. Couple things: has to be CSEC specific. They had to have attended at least 50% of it, yeah, I give all the guidelines there, but it has to be CSEC specific. So I want 50%, if we're looking at sampling techniques, 50% of the participants needed to be in a CSEC specific facility. 50% needed to not have engaged in that facility or have met those guidelines. So I'm hoping it would be awesome if there were 100 participants total for the minimum. They could be more, but I would like it evenly split down the middle. I don't quite know how that would happen, but that's my hope and dream and desire. I said the Pacific Northwest just to narrow it down a little bit more. Again, that is that could be changed. They'll be self-identified using a purposeful sampling method. Already talked about that. So the way it'll be structured is a 45 to 90 minute interview at a location to be determined. Okay. The data collection protocol. So I give this like examples of how the interview might look, that structured interview. I put blank minute there because I was like 45 to 90 minute, and then I wanted to give a little bit of flexibility of like, maybe there is I don't know, maybe someone has an idea for a better amount of time. This is the portion where I'm like, okay, this is where I think I want how things to go, but I'm very open to suggestions. So ethical requirements, obviously there is the potential for re-traumatization. So there's some things taken there specifically around phrasing and clinician interview competency. So the target population is survivors of CSEC. We already talked about that a little bit. The analysis. So I want to use thematic analysis in this one, which is helpful in determining the patterns and themes in qualitative data. And so there would be a team that would be unrelated to the research that would be doing the coding for each of the two groups, finding the themes, and then giving it back to the primary researchers. And they will compare the findings of the two groups. So this is where I struggled and continue to struggle, because I would love a quantitative way to say the experience of these people with post-traumatic. Oh, and they're going to be specifically looking for we're going to be looking for themes around post-traumatic growth. A lot of the interview questions are structured around that. But I would love a quantitative way to define this person has grown post-traumatic in this much post-traumatic growth, and I think that would be possible, but that would mean changing it to a quantitative study using some post-traumatic growth measures, which is absolutely an option. But with this, I think that it would more so be just seeing what people's experiences are and seeing if it warrants a quantitative, like a larger scale quantitative study. So also keeping in mind mitigating factors, such as socioeconomic status, age of participants, years involved in the sex work, age of exit, mental health symptoms, pregnancy, those kinds of things. So I do expect that those who have been involved in a CSEC specific facility will show increased post-traumatic growth afterwards, or higher, that they'll report more like the ability to connect with resources more, the giving back is a big part of post-traumatic growth. That kind of like, here's what I've learned, let me share with you. I think that will be a big part of it, because that is often involved in facilities like this. So I do think it'll be bigger, but I also think that if it's not, that's in and of itself a really good finding, and would require, I think, some more studies to see if that's really happening. And if it is, then we got to find a different way, like that's a pretty big deal if what you're thinking is working is not. And then, looking lastly at what it would be like for, like, if this were to be accurate, right? If the hypothesis that post-traumatic growth will increase if you've gone to a residential facility, then that doing more research around what are the specific methods that are working. How can clinicians get further training in those methods, even if they're not in residential facilities, seeing what are the things that are working that we can replicate. And also I think it would help clinicians have more motivation to be connected and to refer earlier to those residential facilities, and would likely give politicians and insurance companies and all that a bit of a kick in the pants to say, like, if you do this now, then later you might save some money. So I don't want to go, I know I've gone pretty far. I won't talk super long about the limitations. I did mention earlier, I think it's sampling techniques feel really difficult. And then, like I said, my this cultural limitations I don't know that it would be great to apply to everybody. And then also my own personal bias. But that's about it. I would like to do this at some point with a team of people who know more what they're doing. I enjoyed reading this. It was really interesting, or writing this. It was really interesting to read, because I had done part of the literature review like a year ago for another class, and I just did a decent amount of altering with it. It was really interesting to go back through looking for more articles to support what I was looking for, and to kind of realize that there really isn't. They're not there. Like, since the time that I did this last year, I found no more using all the key searches I did on our EBSCO host. And so that was really interesting. I know that there are more out there, but just from what I was searching, there wasn't. So thanks for watching this. Hope you guys all... Oh, here, let's say goodbye to the bunny. All right, let's say goodbye to Mitzi. Future little CSEC therapist. Look, she's so cute. All right, bye, y'all.